The State of Kuwait has always been a pioneer in its generous assistance and humanitarian role to the Arab and Islamic countries, reflecting the wisdom of the Kuwaiti leadership and Kuwaiti people. Kuwait is small in size but large in generosity, as shown in various parts of the world. The massive humanitarian contributions managed to strengthen its international presence through its charitable endowments to worldwide relief efforts, which in turn always backed Kuwait under various circumstances. The supportive role of humanitarian and developmental work has contributed in bolstering its status in the international community, which resulted in the United Nations naming the country a humanitarian centre. Kuwait will be honoured at the United Nations headquarters in September in what will be a distinguished historic event earned by His Highness due to his giving in the realm of philanthropic and humane activities. With regard of His Highness the Amir's keenness on promoting values of giving humane solidarity and advocating such values worldwide, where His Highness's generous hands have extended to peoples of various races and cultures, reflecting the civic and humane image of the State of Kuwait and subsequent generations of the Kuwaiti community known for their passion for charitable work and enthusiasm towards giving and generosity. Kuwait, as a leadership, government and people, offers outstanding contributions to the relief programs of the UN all over the world, through humanitarian aid for countries in need, displaced people, natural disasters and medical supplies. His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah offers to the international community an exemplary, brilliant representation of the tolerant values of Islam. Through his political wisdom, Kuwait has become a global humanitarian center for addressing the obstacles and disasters of Islamic, Arabic and other countries in all parts of the world. On July the 27th, the United Nations, represented by its Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, noted that His Highness the Amir, Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah, will be honoured with the presentation of a Certificate of Appreciation on behalf of the United Nations at the high-level session of the General Assembly, scheduled to take place later in September in New York City. His Highness the Amir will be honoured for his tremendous efforts in humanitarian causes and his contributions in the humanitarian operations carried out by the UN. The UN Secretary-General appreciates Kuwait's supportive stance towards humanitarian activities and the personal commitment of His Highness Sheikh Sabah in the humanitarian activities, which reinforce mutual trust between Kuwait and the United Nations. Minister of Information and Minister of State for Youth Affairs Sheikh Salman Sabah Salim Al-Hamoud Al-Sabah said the United Nations has named Kuwait as an international humanitarian center and His Highness the Emir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah as a humanitarian leader. He pointed out that Kuwait will mark in the UN headquarters the World Humanitarian Day, which commemorates all the people who have lost their lives in humanitarian service and celebrates the spirit that inspires humanitarian work around the world. Sheikh Salman also said that Kuwait's naming as a humanitarian center is for supporting scientific research and human investment that reached numerous societies. The minister also commended the efforts exerted by the Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development, the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development, Kuwait Foundation for Advancement of Science, in addition to other relief and youth voluntary institutions and philanthropic works. He also highlighted Kuwait's effort in assisting conflict-affected countries, particularly its early response to the Syrian crisis, for which it rushed to meet the UN's call to host the first and second donors conference to aid the Syrian people. At the same time, Kuwait was also one of the top countries that supported the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. Kuwaiti people have highly valued the United Nations naming Kuwait as a global humanitarian center and His Highness the Amir a humanitarian leader. The honor of this naming resulted from the humane stances and tangible relief contributions for other nations over the years. For his part, International Islamic Charity Organization or IICO Chairman Dr. Abdullah al-Ma'touq said the UN honouring of His Highness the Amir will be in appreciation for the great humanitarian role played by Kuwait, namely His Highness the Amir, the government and people, particularly the abundant contributions to worldwide relief efforts, sustainable development and productive ventures. His Highness the Amir instructed the IICO to organize 2 NGOs conferences to relieve the Syrian people, simultaneously with the 2 international donations conferences for Syria, during which Kuwait granted some $800 million. Kuwait's charitable activities under His Highness the Amir's guidance have reached all corners of the world to aid the less fortunate and alleviate the suffering of victims of catastrophes and human crises. In addition, Kuwait established campaigns to relieve victims of earthquakes in Pakistan and Turkey and people who suffered from famine and drought in Somalia. Moreover, His Highness the Amir has guided the IICO to call on GCC non-government organizations to coordinate for construction in eastern Sudan. His contributions included the establishment of the $1 billion fund for supporting small and medium enterprises during the Arab Economic Summit. The summit, hosted by Kuwait in 2009, was aimed at helping youth across the Arab world. The UN honouring of His Highness Sheikh Sabah signals appreciation for the international humanitarian organizations and its leaders. The UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon has repeatedly praised Sheikh Sabah as a humanitarian leader who has transformed Kuwait into an international hub for humanitarian giving. The UN also acknowledges Kuwait's significant humanitarian role, implies praise for its charitable activities at the official and grassroots level, and constitutes an important message to all workers in the humanitarian and charitable fields. Ibrahim Ahmed Al-Saleh, Al-Zakat House Director General, said the UN prays for the State of Kuwait as an international humanitarian centre for the non-stop and generous charitable and humanitarian giving at the local, regional and international levels, indicating the importance of the charity work performed by Kuwait. Kuwait leadership has directed the Al-Zakat House to be active at the local and international levels to care for the impoverished. As a result, Kuwait nowadays is living a golden age in the charitable and humanitarian sectors. This is an extension of the contributions of the country's forefathers and ancestors. The Director General for the Administrative and Financial Affairs at the Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development said Kuwait presented, under His Highness the Amir's guidance, his humanitarian initiatives across the world. In addition, the fund's role include contributing to improving living conditions for many individuals, helping in creating job opportunities, limiting poverty and famine, as well as boosting development objectives. Kuwait's hosting of many conferences during which His Highness launched development initiatives constitutes a clear indication of his distinguished role and his keenness on alleviating people's humanitarian hardships, improving living standards and combating poverty. The Director General for Administrative and Financial Affairs at the Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development lauded His Highness the Amir's countless initiatives, namely his proclamation of a program for funding development ventures in non-Arab Asian nations, where he declared a contribution of $300 million. During the era of His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Jabr Al-Sabah, a great deal of international charitable achievements have been accomplished under the name of Kuwait, such as the international conferences for aiding Syria, establishment of the Fund for Financing Enterprises, relieving people of Gaza, and various world countries. Kuwait has earned the title of International Humanitarian Centre due to the country's multitude of philanthropic and humanitarian associations, which have been in the lead globally in terms of credibility, commitment, and launching initiatives. Moreover, charitable action has become a distinguished industry of Kuwait and a source of pride for the Kuwaiti people. For his part, Hamoud Hamad al-Rumi, chairman of the Social Reform Society, said the UN initiative caps His Highness the Amir's continuing sponsorship of humanitarian and charitable activities. Tariq Al-Isa, chairman of the Islamic Heritage Revival Society, said the international honouring of His Highness the Amir should encourage Kuwaiti activists in the domain of charitable work. Chairman of the Director Aid Society, Dr. Abdul Rahman Al-Muhaylan, said the UN gesture is a distinguished historic event and tantamount to an award for the Kuwait relief efforts. He noted Kuwait's leading role in contributions within the framework of UN agencies. Anwar Al-Hassawi, Deputy Chairman of Kuwait Red Crescent Society, said Kuwait earned the title International Humanitarian Center as a result of Kuwait's eagerness in supporting development and aiding crisis-stricken nations, namely the Syrian people. Hosting the International Conference of Donors in support of the humanitarian situation in Syria in the State of Kuwait reflects a strong sense of human compassion and willingness to support the Syrian people, principally His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Jabr Al-Sabah, and the Kuwaiti people's dedication and eagerness for charitable work. On January the 30th, His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Jabr Al-Sabah inaugurated the International Humanitarian Pledging Conference for Syria with the participation of 59 countries. The conference also witnessed the participation of 13 organizations and humanitarian and relief agencies of the United Nations. The conference came in response to the UN Secretary-General's call last December to Kuwait hosting such an event, which was highly welcomed by His Highness the Amir, aimed at lessening the suffering of the Syrian people in and out of the country. The United Nations announced that its specialized agencies needed $1.5 billion to provide adequate funding for its humanitarian program for Syria. The Kuwaiti initiative came from hosting the International Humanitarian Pledging Conference for Syria, which is a ring in a continuous chain of humanitarian works performed by the State of Kuwait for the interest of its Arab and Muslim brothers. His Highness the Emir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Jabr Al-Sabah said in a speech at the opening of the summit since the commencement of the Syria's crises before 22 months, the Kuwaiti aids will never stop, neither on the official nor on the popular level. The international humanitarian pledging is designated for aiding the Syrian people until Syria restores its security and stability. His Highness the Emir Sheikh Sabah noted that Kuwait's hosting of this important meeting comes as a result of the cooperation and coordination with the United Nations, and a response to a valued initiative put forward by His Excellency the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. It also emanates of Kuwait's belief of the need to support the entire international endeavours and efforts exerted to face up to the challenges and perils that threaten global stability and destabilise the economic and social conditions in numerous countries of the world. The State of Kuwait, its government and people have not spared any effort since the eruption of the crisis in Syria to provide humanitarian aid to the brotherly Syrian people through its official and popular institutions. It has also taken every measure to support them inside and outside Syria by Kuwaiti associations specializing in relief and medical work. In Cairo, on February 6, 2013, His Highness the Emir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Jabr Al-Sabah called on the international community, particularly the United Nations Security Council, to act effectively to end the non-stop bloodshed in Syria. His Highness the Emir said in his speech at the opening session of the 12th Summit of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation in the Egyptian capital of Cairo that the humanitarian tragedy in Syria drags on. The Emir highlighted the need for aid in Syria as the number of missing and displaced people continually increases, despite the huge efforts on the regional and international levels of humanitarian relief. His Highness the Emir also highlighted the fruitful outcomes of the International Conference of Syria Donors to support the UN Security Council, which faces an historic moment that requires uniting efforts, overcoming hurdles, and taking swift action to meet the demands of the Syrian people and halt bloodshed. Later, the UN General Assembly meeting was held on the 26th of September of 2013, which addressed many important events. Amongst them was Kuwait's celebration of its 50th anniversary as a member of the global organization. For his part, Deputy Premier and Foreign Minister Sheikh Sabah Khalid Al-Hamid Al-Sabah made a speech. Other major events also included the participation of 131 heads of state and government, as well as the accelerating pace of regional and international affairs. Sheikh Sabah delivered Kuwait's speech before the 68th UN General Assembly. Kuwait was keen on the speech to be inclusive in a bid to contribute to the implementation of the UN plans to fight poverty and improve sustainable development beyond 2015. The Deputy Premier and Foreign Minister thanked UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon for his efforts in this regard. The speech also addressed the Syrian situation. Kuwait hoped the UN Security Council would have a serious stand and stop the bloodshed among the Syrian people and collapse of the state. The State of Kuwait also urged the international community to ease the humanitarian suffering of the Syrians. Kuwait has done and will do what is required to be done to help Syrians, noting that the donors' conference was aimed at easing the suffering of the Syrians. In Europe, the EU official responsible for humanitarian aid praised Kuwait's humanitarian activities around the globe and said that the EU's executive body looked forward to further engagement with Kuwait. EU Commissioner for International Cooperation, Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Response, Kristalina Georgieva, said that the European Commission recognizes the increasingly prominent role which Kuwait has been playing in global humanitarian assistance over recent years, especially in addressing the tremendous humanitarian need caused by the Syria conflict. She said, as the world is facing an unprecedented number of large humanitarian crises, the international community must mobilize and fully coordinate efforts to effectively assist those in need, and the Commission therefore looks forward to further engaging with Kuwait on common endeavors aimed at addressing the humanitarian needs and promoting humanitarian principles. On August the 22nd, the Kuwait Red Crescent Society, or KRCS, announced that Kuwait was and will always be an international humanitarian centre, as well as a pioneer in the field of humanitarian and relief action, under the leadership of His Highness the Amir, Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Jaber Al-Sabah. Dr. Hilal Al-Sayr, president of the KRCS's board of directors, said the UN's honouring of Kuwait as a centre of humanitarian action and His Highness the Amir is considered an honour to all Kuwaitis for their leading humanitarian and philanthropic efforts, noting that this international appreciation requires further efforts by philanthropic societies and the Society in Humanitarian and Relief Work. Al-Sayr said that His Highness the Amir's humanitarian, charitable and relief efforts were well received on regional and international arenas, expressing at the same time his pride in the name given to His Highness the Amir by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, which is appreciated by every Kuwaiti citizen. Al-Sayr added Kuwait occupies a prestigious position among world countries in philanthropic and humanitarian action, representing a guiding light for those who seek excellence in that field, pointing out at the same time Kuwait's aid to the Gaza Strip, to Syria, Sudan, Somalia, Philippines, Bosnia, Serbia, Indonesia, Libya, and other disaster and conflict-affected countries. Providing humanitarian and relief aid is an implementation of the direction of His Highness the Amir to alleviate the suffering of the countries and people. Kuwait, embodied by the KRCS, has emerged as a humanitarian and international centre, becoming a key player in the field of humanitarian action around all continents, adding that Kuwait is not only limited to humanitarian action, but it also has contributions in social, health and educational development, as well as developmental projects. Al-Sayr stated that the KRCS distinctive achievements in humanitarian work on local and international levels have turned it into a model for voluntary work. He also expressed on behalf of all KRCS workers and volunteers congratulations to His Highness the Amir for being recently chosen as a humanitarian leader by the UN, adding at the same time that this was predictable due to His Highness's obvious efforts to the whole world in fields of humanitarian action. Earlier in August, Kuwait sent a humanitarian aid plane to the war-ravaged Gaza Strip. The plane left Abdullah al-Mubarak Air Force Base in Kuwait, heading to the Ismaili Airport in Egypt. The plane carried a load of 10 tons of medical supplies, in addition to a number of KRCS volunteers, to meet the shortage in Gaza hospitals. It was part of an airlift recently launched by the KRCS to transport urgent humanitarian aid to Gaza upon instruction from His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah. The plane's load will be transferred to Rafah Crossing Board in cooperation with the Kuwait Embassy in Egypt and the Egyptian authorities. A nearly month-long devastating Israeli offensive on Gaza has left nearly 1,900 Palestinians dead and over 9,000 wounded. It has also destroyed totally or partially thousands of homes and public facilities in the tiny densely populated strip. Kuwait's outstanding role within the international humanitarian arena under the framework of His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah's initiatives and directions is considered one of the fastest responding aids internationally in presenting exceptional help to countries facing emergencies and disasters. The KRC's projects and programs get strong support from the Kuwaiti leadership, who always pay a closer attention to all philanthropic activities. International humanitarian bodies reach to Libya, Somalia, Thailand, Turkey, Pakistan, and many other countries. On August the 27th, the Egyptian ambassador to Kuwait, Abdulkarim Suleiman, said the UN's honouring of the State of Kuwait and His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah as a humanitarian leader is in recognition of the huge and continuing support of humanitarian work. The honouring of Kuwait is for its humanitarian contributions worldwide and historic accomplishments. The generous people of Kuwait span the globe to feed the hungry, heal the sick, tend to orphans, build mosques and schools, and dig up water wells. He added that 2 international donor talks for Syria hosted by Kuwait, which helped raise billions of dollars in support of the war-ravaged refugees and displaced of Syria, amid its many other charitable initiatives. On August the 28th, Abdul Qadir Amin Sheikh, Somalia's ambassador to Kuwait and Dean of Arab Diplomatic Corps, said the UN's decision to name His Highness the Amir of Kuwait Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah a humanitarian leader is a great honor for the world to have. Ambassador Sheikh pointed out that His Highness the Amir has been known for many years for his assistance to needy people around the world, chiefly towards his own country of Somalia. He recalled His Highness the Amir's initiative in 2012 to help the people of Somalia who were suffering from famine at the time, saying that the Kuwaiti convoys were the first ones to have reached the country as the security situation there was very dangerous. He praised the courageous initiatives of the Kuwait humanitarian aid convoys, which did not hesitate to extend a helping hand despite the worrying security situation, thanks to the wise directions of His Highness the Amir. Ambassador Sheikh said that other convoys from the rest of the world started arriving after the situation had eased. Kuwait is a leading nation in its humanitarian efforts and never hesitates to offer a helping hand to impoverished people around the world under His Highness the Amir's instructions. He added that His Highness the Amir's wise leadership and status and his appreciation by world leaders have all contributed to him being labelled Dean of International Diplomacy. Other factors that have contributed to His Highness the Amir's being granted this high-ranking international attribution were due to his balanced policy based on non-interference in the internal affairs of others. He recalled when world leaders had stood for His Highness's speech, thus making his word heard. He also recalled His Highness the Amir's initiative when he invited the African and Arab leaders to attend the previously concluded 3rd Arab-Africa Summit in Kuwait, in which some 90% of African leaders and their representatives had attended. Ambassador Sheikh spoke highly of His Highness the Amir's being granted an honorary membership of the African Union, thanks to his great role and efforts in narrowing the gap between Africa and the Arab world. He expressed hope that a not-too-distant visit to Somalia by His Highness the Amir would materialize, particularly after the security situation calms down, recalling His Highness the Amir's past frequent private visits. Ambassador Sheikh said that the Somali people will always remember the huge contributions made by the State of Kuwait as directed by His Highness the Amir that included the construction of schools, hospitals, roads, and the provision of humanitarian supplies for the Somali people. Also reflecting the Kuwait generosity, in Geneva on August the 20th, Kuwait donated $5 million to the World Health Organization and to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs to combat the spread of Ebola virus in West Africa. Kuwait's permanent delegate at the United Nations, Ambassador Jamal Al-Ghanem, noted that this donation was ordered by His Highness Sheikh Sabah to aid in this humanitarian crisis. This donation comes in a critical time of fighting this disease, which hit larger geographical areas that have been hit by the virus. Meanwhile, the Sudanese ambassador to Kuwait, Yahya Abdul Jalil Mahmoud, praised Kuwait's Red Crescent Society humanitarian role, which is demonstrated by providing aid to several countries around the world, including Sudan. He expressed his appreciation and gratitude to the KRCS chairman on the previous aid the society had provided the Sudanese people with when they were in need. KRCS's humanitarian efforts stem from the faith of Kuwait's leadership to help their brethren in times of adversity, and providing medical aid to the victims of the yellow fever earlier in Darfur in western Sudan, indicating that the disease caused several deaths. In addition, Ambassador Mahmoud stressed that the deep-rooted relation between Sudan and Kuwait has been strong over the years and in various aspects. Senegal's ambassador to Kuwait and Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Abdullah Mabak, said Kuwait's massive humanitarian contributions to Senegal were one of the factors leading to the UN naming Kuwait as an international centre, and His Highness the Amir as a humanitarian leader in appreciation of Kuwait's significant humanitarian role. Mabak added that His Highness the Amir is widely known for his care and attention to the needy people all over the world, recalling His Highness's initiative in easing the suffering of needy people in Africa. The Senegalese ambassador recalled the great role played by the Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development upon the instructions of His Highness the Amir, including the construction of schools, hospitals, medical centres, as well as roads and other needed humanitarian assistance. Senegal is the biggest beneficiary of the projects carried out by the Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development in sub-Saharan Africa, as the fund has so far executed some 26 projects worth approximately $320 million there. He said that he himself, along with the accredited ambassadors to Kuwait, also hail the role played by His Highness the Amir in reconciliation efforts among Arab countries and at the international level, describing him as the Dean of International Diplomacy. Mbak also said that His Highness the Amir gives his instructions to all state bodies to facilitate the measures and procedures for the diplomatic missions in Kuwait, describing this as highly appreciated. He added that all outgoing ambassadors recall the excellent generosity extended by the State of Kuwait to the accredited diplomats, who never forget the wise instructions and guidance of His Highness the Amir. Mabak said that His Highness the Amir has maintained the same firm position with world countries, saying that occupying this high-ranking international post must be played by an Arab, Islamic or world leader. He said that His Highness the Amir's selection for this post has not come by chance or through mediation, but through his humbleness, diplomatic ties, and the way he treats his own people. He pointed out that Senegal has extended an official invitation for His Highness the Amir to visit Senegal to see for himself the love and affection the Senegalese people have. The State of Kuwait supports humanitarian aid through its Arab Economic Development, which is the first institute in the Middle East that took an active role in the international development efforts. The Kuwait Fund extends loans on concessionary term to finance development projects in the developing countries. The fund also provides technical assistance to finance the costs of the feasibility studies of projects, as well as the training of nationals of the borrowing countries. In addition, the fund subscribes in the capital of the international and regional development institutions. Today, the Kuwait Fund forms a solid bridge of friendship and solidarity between the State of Kuwait and the developing nations. In November of 2007, His Highness the Amir, Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Jabr Sabah, declared in his sublime articulate at the third summit of OPEC, convened at the Saudi capital Riyadh, that Kuwait will donate $150 million to support a program that finances scientific researches related to energy, environment, and climate change. During the 4th Islamic Economic Forum hosted by Kuwait in 2008, Kuwait announced a contribution worth $100 million named the Honorable Life Fund, which had been set up due to negative repercussions of the global food crisis, particularly in the underdeveloped countries. During the Donors Conference, which was convened in Kuwait at the beginning of December of 2010 under the patronage of His Highness the Amir, a contribution of $500 million to East Sudan was announced by Kuwait for infrastructure projects and services. The money will be provided through the Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development. Earlier in October of 2012, during the Asia Cooperation Dialogue Summit, His Highness the Amir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah announced an initiative of $2 billion for financing development projects in non-Arab Asian countries. The contribution of the State of Kuwait to that program in the amount of $300 million was announced by His Highness and said in the opening speech of the first Asia Cooperation Dialogue Summit. On the 3rd Arab-African Summit, His Highness the Emir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah directed officials of the Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development to offer soft loans to African countries in the amount of $1 billion during the next 5 years.